Hi, I'm Jason from CropKing, and today we're going to build the 8-bucket Bato system. So the first thing you'll want to do when you unpack your system is check your packing slip. Make sure you have all the components that are supposed to be with the unit. You will also find the instruction manual, which will guide you through how to assemble if you have questions. Some of the items you should be sure to get are the Bato buckets themselves, drain line and tubing, drain line assembly, wheel kit and wheels, frame kit, pieces of framing, gutter system, reservoir, and perlite. The tools we'd recommend that you have are a 1/2-inch ratchet, a 1/2-inch wrench, a dead blow hammer or some sort of soft-sided mallet, a pair of scissors, and a tape measure. For step one, we're going to begin to assemble the wheel assembly. The first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you locate the proper steel for the job. You're going to need two 46-inch pieces of steel. So there's two ways you can do this. One is just take a tape measure to confirm that your piece of steel is 46 inches. If you don't have a tape measure handy, one nice thing that you can do is you can actually count the holes. So each hole is spaced 1 inch apart. So if you count 46 holes, you know you've got a 46-inch piece of steel. So we're going to need two of those. We're going to need two 20-inch pieces of the rectangular tube. So as you can see, these are a little bit taller than the other size. We're going to need 8 of the 3.5-inch bolts, 16 washers, and 8 hex nuts. We're now going to bolt together the two pieces of steel. So we want our box steel and our rectangular steel. And the way we want to go about this is the box steel is going to set on top of the rectangular steel, like so. We're going to take one of our 3.5-inch bolts and a single washer, and this is going to come up from underneath. So we're going to push this through the first opening on the rectangular steel, take it up through the square steel, hold those two pieces together, another washer, and then a nut. We don't want to tighten down our nut until we're sure that all of our pieces are bolted on correctly to make sure that everything stays square. We can then go to the other side and take the other piece of box steel, and we're going to repeat the same step. 3.5-inch bolt and a washer up from the bottom through the first hole, another washer on top, and then a nut. Now we're going to put in one of the cross members. You're going to slide it underneath the box steel. You'll want a bolt and a washer. Come up through the bottom of the rectangular steel and then up through the tube steel. Now it's important that you keep in mind that you're going to count over 3 holes. So the initial hole that you put your first bolt in would be hole number 1. There'll be an empty hole, and then the third hole is where the bolt is going to come up through. Another washer and a nut. Again, we're not tightening down at this point. And then we'll repeat the same procedure on the front side. Bolt and washer, count over 3 spaces, up through the rectangular steel, and then through the box. We'll now do the same assembly on the far side that we did on the near side. We'll now install the vertical uprights for your system. You're going to first want to locate your two 75-inch long pieces of rectangular steel. These are going to be the 2 longest pieces in the kit. You're also going to want 4 3.5-inch bolts, 8 washers, and 4 hex nuts. To install the vertical upright, you're going to need to do some counting. So you're going to begin with the bolt that you just placed in the first step. That's going to be hole number 1. You're going to want to count in 10 holes. So once you've counted in 10 holes, that's going to take you to the center of your piece of steel. You can do the same from the other side and count in 10 holes. We recommend marking those with a Sharpie so that you don't lose position. We'll now take our 75-inch piece of rectangular steel, and we're going to line it up with the 2 holes that we demarcated earlier. 3.5-inch bolt with a washer. You're going to pass this through the top set of holes and all the way through. Another washer and a nut on the back side. For the second bolt, you're going to stagger. So if you went through the top hole the first time, now you're going to go through the bottom hole, but use the second row of holes. So in other words, you don't want your bolts to be in a straight line. You want them to be on a diagonal. Push through, a washer, and then a nut on the back side. We'll now repeat the same procedure with the second piece of 75-inch box steel. Now that your vertical uprights have been assembled, you can now tighten all the bolts that you have in place. Our next step is to reinforce our vertical supports with 44-inch pieces of square tubing. So locate 2 of these. One will fit to the inside of the frame and the other will fit to the outside of the frame. And you're gonna wanna line up the first hole on each side with the rectangular steel of your vertical support. You're then gonna wanna use one of the 4.5-inch bolts with a washer. And this is now gonna pass through the 1-inch piece of square tubing, the 2-inch piece of rectangular tubing, and then through the second piece of 1-inch square tubing. Use a washer. Pass through all 3 pieces of steel, another washer, and then a nut. And you'll repeat the same procedure on the second side. You can now take your ratchet and your wrench and tighten the 2 bolts that you just put in place. The next procedure is to place the horizontal support member on top of your vertical pieces of framing. You're gonna wanna locate the 44-inch piece of rectangular steel. You wanna find your 4 black gusset plates. You need 16 washers, 8 hex nuts, and 8 2.5-inch bolts. So what we want to do now is take this 44-inch piece and we're actually going to set it right on top of our vertical supports. We'll then take one of our gusset plates, a bolt, and a washer. So when putting in your gusset plate, you do want to make sure that you count the proper number of holes. So the gusset plate is going to go in, you can start at hole number 1, skip 1 hole, and then you're going to use holes number 3 and 4. So I'm going to line this with holes 3 and 4, take my bolt with washer, I'm going to pass through. I'll now take a second gusset plate and make sure you're aligning the same holes. So if you use the outside hole here, you'll use the outside hole here on the back side. Pinch these in place, a washer and a nut. You can then repeat the procedure at hole number 3. If you installed the top of the gusset correctly, the holes on the vertical support should line up perfectly as well. But these are also holes number 2 and number 3 on the vertical support. A bolt with a washer, pass through both gussets, and then a washer and nut on the back side. You'll then want to repeat this exact same procedure on the far side of your unit. You can now use your ratchet and your wrench and tighten down the 4 bolts on each side. For the next step, we're going to assemble the table assembly to hold the Bato buckets. So you're going to want to locate 2 of the 26-inch pieces of rectangular steel. You're going to need 4 1.5-inch bolts. You'll need 8 of the 2.5-inch bolts, and then an equivalent amount of washers and nuts. So the way this goes, we want to do some counting again. So in order to get this aligned properly, you're going to want to start with the bolt that you put through, that went through the piece of 1-inch tube, the piece of 2-inch rectangular, and then back through the second piece of 1-inch tube. And from there, you want to count up 17 holes. So this would be hole number 1, count up 17 spaces, and then you're going to use holes number 18 and 19 to connect your piece of 2-inch rectangular steel. As far as this is concerned, you want to count in 12 holes and use the 13th hole from each end to connect. So once we've done that, we can take a bolt and a washer, and we want to align these 2 pieces at the proper hole. Now you want to make sure that this 26-inch piece sits to the inside of your vertical support. You'll repeat this for all 4 holes so that each of the 4 holes on the back side of the 26-inch piece have a bolt and washer and nut passing through. Once all 4 bolts are in place, you can repeat the same procedure on the second side. Once the 2 cross members are in place, you can then take your ratchet and your wrench and secure all 8 bolts. For the next step, we want to install the edge joints. These edge joints have 3 different lengths. You want to make sure that the longest length is pointing down when you put it onto your horizontal cross member. You'll then take a 1.5 inch bolt with a washer passed through from the outside, and then a washer and a nut on the back side. If you've installed these properly, the holes should align on the top and the side. You'll then repeat this procedure on the far end. Once all 4 edge joints are in place, you can then tighten the bolts. We'll now build out the rest of the table assembly. You want to start with the 42-inch piece of rectangular steel. You'll need 2 of those. You'll need 4 42-inch pieces of square tubing. You'll need 8 3.5-inch bolts, 4 4.5-inch bolts, 4 1.5-inch bolts, and then an equivalent number of nuts and washers. So for the first step, we'll begin with taking our piece of rectangular steel, and we're going to place it on top of our cross members. Take a 4.5-inch bolt with a washer. You want to come up from the underside. In this case, you're going to be at hole number 1 on your horizontal support, and you're going to come up through hole number 1 on your vertical piece. Pass up all the way through, a washer, and then nut. And you can repeat that same procedure on the second side. Next, we'll take a piece of 42-inch square tube, and this is going to sit in the same orientation, but now we're going to align with hole number 2 on the horizontal cross member. We'll still be using hole number 1 on the piece of square tubing, but hole number 2 on the horizontal piece. A 3.5-inch bolt with washer. You'll again come up through the bottom, a washer, and then hand tight with a hex nut. And again, you'll repeat the same procedure on the second side. For the third horizontal cross member, we're going to want to do some counting again. So in this case, we want to start with hole 1, hole 2, those are our first 2 bolted holes, and then you're going to have 4 vacant holes. So 1, 2, 3, 4 vacant holes. In the 5th hole, we're going to take another piece of 42-inch box steel, place it on top of the horizontal cross member, a 3.5-inch bolt and washer. We'll come up through the bottom, a washer on top, and then hand tight with a hex nut. You'll then repeat this procedure on the second side. We'll now take another piece of 42-inch box steel, and we're going to align it now with our edge joints. We're going to want a 1.5-inch bolt with washer, and we're going to pass this through to the inside. We'll put a washer on the back side and then secure with a hex nut. You can then repeat this procedure on the second side. For our final set of steps to complete the table, we will replicate the installation that we just did on the back side in a mirror image on the front side. Once you've installed all horizontal pieces of the table support, you can then take your ratchet and your wrench and tighten all bolts. Our next step is to install the casters onto the support pieces, which will eventually go onto the frame of the Bato bucket system. What you'll need for this is 2 rigid casters, 2 swiveling casters, 16 of your 1.75-inch bolts, 32 washers, and 16 hex nuts. As we attach these to the frame pieces, understand that we do have a slotted hole here, so it's important that you do not tighten past hand tight until we're ready to put our attachment pieces onto the frame. We're now ready to install one of our casters onto our 2 pieces of support frame. Choose any one of the casters and make sure that the long edge of the caster is parallel to your piece of steel and that the short edge runs perpendicular. So they're going to align like this. You'll take one of your bolts with a washer, you'll come down through the top and through the slotted hole, a washer on the back side, and then a nut. And then you'll do that again for the second hole. If you're doing this correctly, there should be 2 holes that have been covered by the plate of the caster. You'll then repeat the same procedure with the second piece of framing. You can now complete the same procedure 3 more times with the 3 additional casters and pieces of frame. Our final step with the frame assembly is to install the casters. Now we have the benefit of being able to set ours up on the table, but you can also do this from the floor. Either way is going to work just fine. You've got 2 sets of casters. You have the swivels and you have the rigid. Make sure that those 2 are coupled together. Don't commingle a rigid with a swivel or your unit's not going to move correctly. So the first one we'll do is one of our swivel casters. So we'll begin with a 4.5-inch bolt and a washer. And we're going to want to orient our swivel caster so that the outermost support piece is leaning up against this 1-inch piece of tube steel. And we want to align hole number 1 and hole number 3 with our 2 pieces of rectangular steel. We'll take this bolt, we'll insert it into hole number 2 at the bottom of the rectangular steel. It'll go up through and into our support piece for our caster assembly. We'll put a washer and a nut. We can then repeat that procedure with a second bolt. This time we're going to go through the first piece of rectangular steel. We want to make sure as we're installing this that the caster is actually pointing out or away from the central point of the unit if installed correctly. We'll repeat the same procedure again for the inner piece of support steel. You can now repeat this exact same procedure for your second swivel caster on the bottom side of the unit. Our final installation is our rigid casters. These are going to be oriented slightly different than the swivel casters that we just put in place. In this case, our rigid casters are actually going to go now to the inside of the unit. So the same alignment is going to take place. We're going to align hole number 1 with this outer piece of 2-inch tube steel or rectangular steel. We'll take a washer and a bolt and come up through the bottom and through hole number 1 to secure the piece of framing. Then do the same procedure, this time with the second bolt going through the second piece of rectangular tubing. Once the top 2 bolts are in place, you can then put the second bolts into the second piece of reinforcement tubing. And then repeat with the second piece. You're now ready to install the second and final rigid caster on the lower portion of your Bato bucket system. You can now use your socket and your wrench to tighten down all the bolts that were used for the wheel assembly. The final procedure for the actual stand itself is to put in the protective caps. These are going to go at the end of the pieces of tubing. So there's 2 different size caps. There's the 1-inch by 1-inch. You'll notice there's a notch in the 1-inch by 1-inch. This is meant to align with the orientation of the bolt. Therefore, if the bolt is vertical, you want the notches to align vertically. The rectangular pieces, those don't really matter. You can put them in any way you want because they're going to have to fit in the correct orientation no matter how you set them. We're now ready to put together our feed assembly. We're going to begin by starting with the 1/2-inch black hose. We're going to need to cut some pieces from this. So we're going to start by cutting 4 5-inch pieces and 4 4-inch pieces. Use your tape measure to measure those out precisely. So we're now ready to start to piece together the feed tube assembly. We're going to start with one of the two greenback valves and one of our 5-inch long pieces of tubing, and we're going to press that onto either end of the greenback valve like such. You're then going to take one of the T-junctions and insert it into the open end of the piece of tubing. You want to try to make sure to press that all the way to where it sits tightly against the last barb. Since you used a 5-inch long piece the first time, you're now going to use a 4-inch long piece. So take one from your 4-inch pile and you're going to put it onto the other end of the T, like such. Another T, and now you'll go back to another 5-inch piece. You're going to continue in this configuration until you've used up all of your cut pieces. So it goes 5, T, 4, T, 5, T, 4, T, and so on until all pieces of tubing have been used up. Once you've completed your assembly for the feed tubing, you can then repeat the exact same process for the second side. At the end, you want to have 2 of these assemblies together to move on to the next step. We're now ready to cut the pieces for the stake assembly. You're going to start with your black feed tube, and you want to cut 16 3-inch pieces. So measure out 3 inches, make a cut, and so on until you have cut 16 pieces. The next step for your stake assembly is your spaghetti tube, and you're going to want to measure out 16 14-inch long pieces. So again, using your ruler, mark 14 inches and cut. And again, you will need 16 of these, just as you did with your black tubing. We're now ready to put together one of our stake assemblies. So we're going to begin with our 3-inch piece of black tubing. We're going to take one of our Veriflow valves, and we're going to insert one end of the Veriflow valve into an end of the black tubing. You'll then take your piece of white spaghetti tubing, and you'll insert that onto the other open end of the Veriflow valve. These can be a little tight. It's helpful to add a little bit of heat. So in our case, we used a heat gun. You can also use a hair dryer, and it'll soften the plastic and allow it to seat properly. Once these 2 pieces of tubing are in place, you'll take one of the drip stakes, and the drip stake will insert into the open end of the white spaghetti tube. You now have one of your stake assemblies completed. One stake assembly will install onto the end of the barb that we used to make the T-junction in our earlier step. So take the open end of the black tube, insert onto the T, and you've now installed one of your stake assemblies onto your feed tubing. You'll repeat this process for the remaining 7 barbs on both of your pieces of feed tubing. We're going to go back to our 1/2-inch black tubing, and now we're going to cut 2 pieces that are 18 inches long. Additionally, we'll need to cut 2 pieces of black tubing that are 3 inches long. We'll now attach our 2 18-inch long pieces to the final T-junction on the feed tube line. And then repeat for the second line. We're now ready to assemble the T-junction. We'll begin with one of the 90-degree elbows and take one of our 3-inch pieces and insert it onto the barb of the 90-degree elbow. Once inserted, you can then take your T and insert that into the other end of the 3-inch tube. It's important that the elbow face up and the T faces down. You'll then repeat this step on the other side. When finished, your assembly should look like this. You'll now use the open end of the 2 90-degree elbows to attach to the 18-inch piece of black tubing that we just installed. You'll then repeat this step with the second piece of feed tubing. We'll now cut our final piece of feed tubing. We're going to measure 5 feet of feed tubing. This doesn't have to be very precise. Really, you just want enough feed tubing to take you from the T that you just created down to your pump that will sit in your reservoir. We're going to recommend about 5 feet. So once you have that 5-foot length, you're going to place that on the bottom of the T that you created previously. Fit those 2 pieces together. You'll now take the open piece of tubing and attach it to your submersible pump. So remove your pump from the box. And you'll now need to choose the correct barb to screw into the top of your pump. You'll have a host of different sizes that come with the pump. You want to choose the one that's going to fit appropriately inside of a piece of 1/2-inch tubing, which in our case will be the smallest of the barbs offered. Once you've got the correct barb, you're going to screw the barb into the threading on the top of your pump. Before placing the tube over top of the barb, make sure you have your snap clamp ring. Place it over the 1/2-inch tubing. You're now ready to place your 1/2-inch tubing onto the barb on top of the pump. Slide the snap ring down to the base where the tubing meets the barb and snap it shut. And your pump is now assembled. We're now ready to build our drain assembly. So we're going to start with our 2 pieces of drain pipe here, and we're going to take a single end cap. We're going to use our silicone. We're not actually going to apply this today, but you would want to cut open your silicone, get a good amount inside the cap, and then put some on the outside of the drain pipe. And then you're going to marry those 2 pieces together. Make sure you give them sufficient time to dry. Once that piece is in place, you can then take your elbow, same situation as the end cap. You're going to want to put a bead of silicone caulk on there, a bead on the inside of your 90-degree elbow, and then you're going to push those 2 pieces together like such. Next thing you're going to want is your PVC bushing and your ram connector. The ram connector will actually thread right into the bushing. Now, there's some controversy as to the best policy here. You can do this without silicone tape if you want. However, if you want to put some waterproofing silicone tape on the threading, you can do that. In this situation, we're not going to apply any silicone tape. We're going to screw those together. You can use a wrench to tighten that down. Another bead of silicone caulk on the outside of the bushing, silicone caulk on the inside of the 90-degree elbow, and then these 2 pieces are going to push together and marry together. So you're going to do that exact same step a second time on your second piece of drain tubing. The final step of the drain assembly is to now apply a piece of 1/2-inch black tubing to the end of the ram connector. So again, kind of like the feed tubing, there's no exact length that you have to cut. You just want to make sure your drain line makes it back to the reservoir. I'm going to recommend using about 4 feet of black tubing. That's what we're going to cut for today. We want to make sure that we're cutting 2 pieces of 4-foot long drain line to attach to the ram connector. Once you've got your 4-foot piece of black 1/2-inch tubing, you can now apply this to the end of the ram connector at the end of your drain assembly. Push these 2 pieces together so that they fit together tightly. We can now install our Bato bucket elbows. So all pieces are exactly the same, but what you're going to want to do is make sure that you take the female end of one of the elbows and the male end of another elbow and put those together and push until you hear a click. Once those pieces snap together, your assembly should look something like this. Once you have one of your Bato buckets, look in the bottom and you'll notice that there's a hole, an opening at the bottom, and there's also a post at the very bottom. You're going to want to take the male end of the elbow and insert that down into the hole of the Bato bucket. The female end will go over top of the ridge that's at the bottom of the Bato bucket trough. So I usually slip the female piece over first and then push the male assembly down into the hole. And again, if you do it correctly, you'll hear it click. And that's what your final assembly should look like. We're now ready to finish up our 8-bucket system. And the first thing we want to do is to install our 30-gallon reservoir, which sits directly below the table of the 8-bucket system. Next, we want to install our 2 pieces of drain line. The drain line will rest on the innermost support piece nearest your vertical uprights. And you'll repeat this step on the back side. The 2 pieces of drain tubing that you have can now go into your reservoir. Our next step is to install our feed tubing. So the way we want to do this is make sure that our pump is in the same orientation as our drain lines. So pump will rest here. Our feed tubing will now sit on top of the gutters. We can now zip tie on the feed lines to help hold them in place. Pass the zip tie through 2 of the holes in your vertical support, double it back in front of your green bag valve, and zip tie in place. We'll repeat that procedure on the other side with the second piece of feed tubing. You can now take the slack out of your piece of feed tubing and attach a second zip tie on the second vertical upright on the far side of the unit. You'll then repeat that step on the other side. If installed correctly, your assembly should fit right over top of your gutters. You're now ready to put your pump into your reservoir. So untie your cord and you're going to insert the entire pump down into the reservoir, ensuring that the cord and the rest of your feed tube is able to come out of the top of your reservoir. You're now ready to install your buckets on your new system. So one by one, you can take the buckets, and the best way to install these is to line up the front edge with the Bato bucket with the front edge of your 2-inch rectangular steel. Once that's in place, you'll then position the gutter so that the opening at the back of the Bato bucket aligns with the opening in the piece of PVC. And if done correctly, the 2 pieces should sit together like such. You'll now go down the line and install all 4 buckets on either side. Included with your reservoir is enough perlite to fill all 8 buckets. The best way to do this is to first hydrate your perlite. So you'll want to cut an opening at the top of the bag of perlite and then fill that with either a hose or a faucet until the bag appears to be fully hydrated with water. You can then poke small holes in the bottom of the bag to allow water to escape, but ideally not to allow perlite to escape. As that water runs out, at some point, the perlite will retain all of the moisture and no more water will run out of the bag. At that point, you're ready to add perlite to your buckets. We recommend adding perlite to the line at the top of the bucket. This happens to be the same line where the bucket covers will sit. Anything more than this and your bucket covers will not sit properly. Even if you let a little bit of perlite go below the line, that's also okay. One important thing to remember before you use your system is make sure that your green back valves, you'll have 2, are turned into the off position. Off position means that the green back valve is perpendicular to your piece of tubing. If they run parallel, water will come out of these. One other important thing to keep in mind is your new Veriflow valves are an on-off switch for your drip emitters. If the arrow is in line with the spaghetti tube, it's on and water should be flowing at this time. If, however, the arrow is perpendicular to the spaghetti tube, that is the off position and water will not flow in that case. Congratulations, you've now completed your 8-bucket system. CropKing is here to support you from start to finish. If you have any questions along the way, please give us a call or shoot us an email. Let us know what we can help you with. We'd love to see your pictures on social media, so please feel free to post any pictures that you have of you having fun with your new system. And thank you so much for choosing CropKing.